There comes a moment in all of our lives when the weight of caring too much begins to feel like a silent prison. A prison where your peace becomes held hostage by other people's actions, where your joy becomes dependent on outcomes you can't control, and your worth starts getting negotiated through the lens of others' opinions. But there is a sacred wisdom in learning to act like you don't care, not because you've become cold or indifferent, but because you've grown in discernment. Because the truth is, not everything deserves your energy, your tears, or your overthinking. Sometimes the most powerful spiritual posture is peace, unshaken peace. This isn't about building walls, it's about building boundaries. This isn't about shutting people out, it's about stepping into emotional freedom. It's about reclaiming the parts of you that have been scattered in the efforts to be understood, to be accepted, to be validated. When you learn to act like you don't care, you're not abandoning love, you're realigning it. You're choosing to love yourself enough to stop begging for crumbs of affection, to stop explaining your heart to ears that are committed to misunderstanding you. Acting like you don't care is not an invitation to be passive. It is a discipline of the spirit, a discipline that teaches you to be still when your flesh wants to react, to be calm when your emotions rage, to walk away when your ego wants to prove something. There is power in your silence, and there is authority in your restraint. When you walk in this kind of freedom, you stop dancing for approval. You stop shrinking yourself just to keep someone comfortable. You stop living in fear of being left, because you finally learn to sit in the fullness of your presence, even if no one else applauds it. This is spiritual maturity, the ability to observe chaos and not be swallowed by it, the ability to bless those who misunderstood you and keep walking, the ability to hear the noise and choose not to respond, because you're not trying to win people, you're trying to protect your peace. You understand now that if it costs your peace, it's too expensive. And anything that disrupts the voice of God in your life is not worth entertaining. In this conversation, we are going to unlearn emotional codependency. We are going to break free from the addiction of needing to be liked. We are going to confront the inner child that still aches to be seen and tell her that we see her, we love her, but we don't need to perform anymore. You are enough, even when you are silent. You are chosen, even when you're not validated. You are powerful, even when you walk away. So, lean in, because the moment you learn to act like you don't care, in the spirit, in wisdom, and in truth, you will discover a new kind of authority. One that doesn't scream for attention, but shifts atmospheres by simply standing still. There is a sacred strength in the art of emotional detachment. It is not the absence of care, but the wisdom to know what is worthy of your care. Life will always present situations and people that try to pull on the strings of your emotions, begging for a reaction, for your attention, for your energy. But spiritual maturity teaches you that not every battle is yours to fight, not every opinion is yours to correct, and not every wound deserves your constant bleeding. Emotional detachment is the decision to protect your peace by stepping back instead of stepping in, to observe rather than absorb, and to hold space for yourself rather than hold on to things that break you. It is a strength that does not always roar, but sometimes whispers, "I don't need to be involved in this." Learning to detach emotionally does not mean you become numb. It does not mean you walk through life cold, indifferent, or hardened. In fact, it requires a tender heart and a sound mind to know when to release something that's trying to drown you in waves you didn't create. Emotional detachment is the response of a soul that has been through battles, cried through nights, fought to be heard, and finally realized that the most powerful statement it can make is silence. Silence that says, "I will not give you the power to disturb my inner world." This type of detachment is deeply spiritual because it recognizes that your peace is not on the surface, it's rooted in God. And if it's rooted in God, then no person, no situation, no betrayal can uproot it unless you hand them the shovel. When you don't practice emotional detachment, you find yourself constantly overthinking. You replay conversations, you decode text messages, you feel anxious about being misunderstood or misrepresented. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to hand pieces of yourself to people who were never called to carry them. But when you learn to act like you don't care, not from bitterness, but from clarity, you begin to reclaim those lost pieces. You begin to come back to yourself. You begin to see things for what they truly are, instead of what you emotionally hoped them to be. And in that space, clarity is born. It's no longer about controlling how others see you. It's about controlling how much access they have to your peace. There will always be moments that test your emotions. A comment that cuts deep, a friend who turns distant, a door that closes unexpectedly. And in these moments, emotional detachment teaches you not to respond from the wound, but from the well of peace within you. You don't chase explanations. You don't fight to prove your worth. You don't beg for someone to see you. Because when you are anchored in God, you know that your identity is not found in their approval. It is found in His presence, and that is more than enough. Sometimes detaching emotionally means choosing to walk away from conversations that trigger your past. Sometimes it means giving yourself permission to let people misunderstand you. Sometimes it means loving someone from a distance because proximity was damaging your soul. And sometimes it means being okay with not having the last word. The flesh wants to defend itself. The ego wants to be right. But the spirit wants peace. And peace often looks like letting go, trusting God to vindicate, and resting in the truth that not everything needs a reaction. Detachment is not a loss, it's a gain. You gain clarity, you gain strength, you gain the ability to discern what matters and what's just noise. It creates space for God to step in. When your hands are off, His hands move freely. When your heart is calm, His voice becomes louder. And when your soul is detached from the chaos, it becomes more aligned with heaven's rhythm. In a world that demands reactions, that thrives on attention, and feeds off emotional volatility, the ability to stay still is radical. It is revolutionary, and it is deeply spiritual. You are not cold for choosing peace. You are not heartless for protecting your energy. You are not careless for walking away from what kept breaking you. You are simply healing. And in that healing, God is teaching you the power of emotional detachment, not to turn you into someone unfeeling, but to transform you into someone unstoppable. Because when your emotions no longer control you, when your triggers no longer direct your behavior, and when your heart no longer craves validation, you become someone who cannot be manipulated. And that, beloved, is a threat to every lie the enemy has ever told you. You don't have to fight to be enough. You just have to be still and know that you are. When you've lived your life giving too much of yourself away, there comes a time when you finally realize that begging, whether for love, for attention, for clarity, or even for apology, is beneath the identity of a child of God. You begin to understand that the energy you give to constantly proving yourself, over-explaining your heart, or holding together what should have fallen apart a long time ago, is energy that could be invested into your healing, your growth, and your purpose. Choosing boundaries over begging is the moment your soul says, I am no longer going to exhaust myself trying to hold up broken dynamics that are not aligned with who I am becoming. It's a radical act of self-respect. It is the sacred decision to no longer put your soul on clearance for people who don't know how to steward your value. You were not created to grovel. You were not created to plead for consistency. You were not created to chase people just so they'll treat you right. That is not what love looks like. That is not what identity feels like. That is not what God intended when He called you His own. When you choose boundaries, you're saying to the world, I now understand who I am, and I'm no longer afraid to act like it. A boundary is not a wall to keep people out. It is a gate to protect what's sacred within. And the most sacred thing you possess is your peace, your purpose, your identity, and your time. There is something deeply spiritual about boundaries. They are not just psychological tools, they are spiritual weapons. They protect you from becoming entangled in cycles God has already delivered you from. They keep you anchored when your emotions try to drag you back into old patterns. And they remind you that love does not mean limitless access. Because when someone has to be begged to stay, to change, to care, what you're experiencing is not love, it's survival. And God never intended for you to live in survival mode. He calls you to thrive in freedom. Boundaries give you that freedom. Many people are afraid to set boundaries because they fear being alone. But what you must understand is that the temporary discomfort of loneliness is far lighter than the permanent weight of being misused. When you live without boundaries, you train people to believe that your soul is available for their convenience. You teach them that you'll tolerate inconsistency, disrespect, half-hearted efforts, and emotional manipulation. But when you draw the line, you teach them something new, that your heart is not a playground, that your time is valuable, and that your presence is a privilege, not a right. Begging may get you temporary closeness, but it will never give you lasting intimacy. It might keep someone near you physically, but they'll never truly be with you emotionally, spiritually, or mentally. And in the end, you'll still feel alone, except now you're alone with someone, which is lonelier than being alone without them. Boundaries, on the other hand, will remove the illusion so you can make room for the real. They'll clear out the noise so that the voice of God can echo through your soul again. You will no longer have to beg for the bare minimum, because you've already declared that anything less than honor, anything less than truth, anything less than alignment is unacceptable. This doesn't mean you become rude or harsh. It means you become rooted in truth, rooted in your worth, rooted in your awareness that you are not for everyone, and that's okay. Boundaries don't make you mean, they make you clear, and clarity is powerful. Because the moment you become clear on who you are, you stop trying to convince others to treat you right. You simply allow their behavior to determine their access. That's wisdom. That's freedom. That's growth. And perhaps most importantly, boundaries are not just about keeping others in check. They're also about keeping yourself accountable. You begin to recognize the places where you gave too much, stayed too long, ignored too many red flags, all in the name of love or loyalty. And you forgive yourself, not just for what you allowed, but for what you didn't know yet how to resist. Then from that place of compassion, you build new standards, not out of bitterness, but out of revelation. You stop begging for someone to see your worth because you've already seen it for yourself. And once you've seen it, you refuse to lower your gaze again. Choosing boundaries over begging is a holy shift. It is a transition from survival to sovereignty. It is the moment you stop explaining why you deserve better and start embodying it. It's when you stop knocking on closed doors and start building a life where you are the one doing the choosing, the allowing, the inviting. You become the gatekeeper of your peace, and not everyone is welcome to sit at the table of your life. Only those who bring truth, honor, safety, and alignment. Only those who can meet you at the level of your healed self, not the version of you that was desperate for connection. You don't have to beg. You just have to choose. Choose boundaries. Choose peace. Choose yourself. Again and again, until it becomes your natural response. Because the more you honor yourself, the more your life will begin to reflect the kind of love God always intended for you to receive. There is something incredibly powerful about choosing silence. Not the silence of suppression or avoidance, but the silence of restraint, of discernment, of power held gently. In a world that thrives on noise, constant opinions, arguments, explanations, and reactions, silence has become a rare and radical form of spiritual warfare. When someone provokes you, when circumstances tempt you to lash out or defend yourself, choosing silence is not weakness. It is strength dressed in wisdom. It is self-control fueled by the Holy Spirit. It is the decision to protect your peace rather than prove your point. This kind of silence is not about being passive. It is about being powerful without performance. Sometimes we think speaking up will give us control, but often it only gives the enemy more space to entangle us in drama, offense, and emotional turmoil. Silence does not mean you're losing. In fact, in the kingdom, silence can be the sound of victory. When Jesus stood before his accusers, mocked and falsely charged, he could have said a word and changed everything, but he chose silence. That silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was submission to a greater will. And sometimes in your life, the Holy Spirit will lead you to say nothing, to respond with peace, to walk away with dignity, not because you're retreating, but because you're operating from a higher place. Silence teaches you that not every battle needs your voice. Some battles require your stillness so that God's voice can be the loudest. When you're always responding, always defending, always explaining, you leave no room for divine intervention. But when you are quiet, when you withdraw from the chaos, when you stop feeding the flames, you invite God to be your defender. And his defense is always greater than anything you could say. His vindication is always more complete than any explanation you could offer. Silence doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about your spirit not to entangle it in foolishness. There are moments when silence becomes your shield. It guards you from unnecessary drama. It protects your mind from the need to overthink every word. It shields your heart from being baited into emotional spirals that lead nowhere. Because the truth is, not everyone who wants to argue with you is worthy of your attention. Not every offense is worth your energy, and not every betrayal deserves a response. The maturity to hold your peace when everything in you wants to retaliate, that is spiritual growth, that is authority, that is you refusing to let the enemy pull you into warfare that God never told you to fight. Silence gives you perspective. When you stop talking, you start listening first to yourself, then to God. You hear your own heart more clearly. You realize that sometimes your desire to speak came from insecurity, from a need to be seen or validated. But in the quiet, you discover that you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to chase closure. You don't need to fix what others refuse to understand. Your value is not proven in how well you defend yourself. It's revealed in how well you protect your peace. When you are secure in who you are, silence becomes easy. You realize that being loud isn't what makes you powerful. Being rooted does. There are times when your silence will confuse people. They will expect a reaction. And when you don't give it, they'll wonder why. Let them wonder. Because your silence is not for them. It's for you. It's your way of reclaiming your narrative, of refusing to be manipulated, of walking away instead of being pulled down. Silence is your declaration that you will not let the chaos of others disrupt the calm of your spirit. It is your quiet way of saying, I trust God more than I trust this moment. I trust His justice more than I trust my emotions. I trust that my peace is more important than being understood. You'll also notice that the more you practice silence, the less reactive you become. You begin to discern what deserves your attention and what simply doesn't. You stop wasting time explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop feeling the need to constantly justify your boundaries, your decisions, your healing. And instead, you stand still. Because you know now that stillness is not inactivity, it is intentionality. It is the wisdom to wait for the right time or to not speak at all. It is alignment with God's timing and trust in His outcome. This silence is sacred. It becomes the atmosphere where God moves. It becomes the space where your soul breathes. It becomes the posture where your discernment grows. Because when you're no longer talking just to be heard, you begin to speak only when it matters. And when you do speak, your voice carries weight. Because you've learned how to listen first. You've learned how to sit with your emotions before releasing them. You've learned how to let God process your pain before you present it to people. And that is maturity. That is wisdom. That is what makes you dangerous to the enemy. Because you no longer react, you respond. And when you respond, you do so with clarity, with peace, with divine timing. So don't be afraid to be silent. Let people think what they want. Let situations unfold. Let God reveal the truth in time. Your silence is not empty, it is full of faith. It is an act of spiritual resistance, a form of warfare that the world doesn't understand. But heaven does, and heaven moves in silence that is rooted in trust. There comes a point in your journey when the need for validation begins to feel like a prison. You start to recognize that chasing approval, needing to be liked, and seeking constant reassurance are signs that your identity has been entangled in the fragile opinions of people who don't even understand the depths of who you are. Releasing the need for validation is not about arrogance, it's about liberation. It is about stepping into the fullness of who you are without waiting for someone to nod in agreement. It is about knowing your worth even when no one claps for you. Because the truth is, if your confidence is built on the applause of others, it will crumble when they stop clapping. But when your confidence is rooted in God, you can walk in rooms unacknowledged and still know you belong. Validation is something many of us were taught to seek from a young age. We were conditioned to associate approval with love, attention with worthiness, and acceptance with safety. So we began to shape ourselves around what would keep us loved, seen, and praised. We became performers, hiding our true thoughts, burying our pain, shrinking our dreams just to avoid being rejected. But that performance becomes exhausting. Eventually, your soul will start to ache, not because people don't love you, but because you don't recognize yourself anymore. You've given so much of your identity away just to be acceptable, that when you finally look in the mirror, you don't know who's staring back. That's when the Holy Spirit begins to whisper, "Come out of hiding." Releasing the need for validation is an invitation to come out of hiding. It's the moment you choose to show up as your authentic self, not the edited version that others prefer. It means you stop editing your truth to make people comfortable. It means you stop diluting your anointing so you don't intimidate the insecure. It means you stop seeking permission to be who God already called you to be. Because the truth is, the people who truly love you will not require you to perform. They will not need you to be perfect. They will not punish you for being honest. They will celebrate your truth, not just your image. But when you are addicted to validation, you attract people who only love the version of you that benefits them and reject the parts of you that require depth. It's also important to understand that validation can become a form of bondage. It keeps you stuck in cycles where your emotions rise and fall based on how people respond to you. You become a slave to likes, to comments, to compliments, to invitations. You base your self-worth on what people say or don't say, how they treat you, whether they see you or ignore you. But this is a trap, because people are fickle. They change. One day they love you, the next day they forget you. One moment they applaud you, the next moment they criticize you. And if your identity is tied to their approval, you'll never be stable. You'll live like a leaf in the wind, tossed around by every change in opinion. But when you release the need for validation, something inside of you becomes grounded. You begin to stand in truth, even if you stand alone. You begin to speak boldly, even if your voice shakes. You begin to move in your calling, even if no one affirms you. because you finally come to the place where God's well done is more than enough. You no longer need people to clap for what God already confirmed in the secret place. You no longer need external affirmation to validate an internal knowing. You trust what God said about you. You believe what He whispered in your spirit. And you refuse to trade that divine truth for the fleeting approval of people. Releasing the need for validation also unlocks a deeper level of creativity, freedom, and spiritual authority. When you stop seeking permission, you start walking in purpose. You stop waiting for someone to pick you, and you realize you are already chosen. You stop filtering your ideas through the lens of will they like this, and you start asking, does this please God? That shift changes everything. It moves you from performance to purpose, from insecurity to identity, from approval, addiction to divine confidence. And when you walk in that kind of freedom, your life becomes a magnet for heaven's favor. Of course, this journey isn't easy. There will be moments where the silence of others feels loud, moments where you question yourself, moments where rejection stings. But even in those moments, you begin to see them differently. Rejection no longer feels like failure. It becomes redirection. Silence no longer feels like punishment. It becomes clarity. You stop begging to be seen, and you start seeing yourself. And once you truly see yourself through the lens of heaven, no human opinion can diminish your value. This is what healing looks like. This is what alignment feels like. When you release the need for validation, you begin to breathe again. You begin to live again. You begin to trust yourself again. And most importantly, you begin to trust God more than the crowd. You realize that obedience will sometimes isolate you. Truth will sometimes cost you popularity. But peace, real peace, is worth the price. And when you no longer need the applause of others to feel valuable, you become unstoppable. Because your identity is no longer up for debate. It is rooted, it is sealed, it is divine. Choosing peace over performance is one of the most transformational decisions you will ever make. It is the moment you stop striving to impress, to compete, to be everything for everyone, and you finally rest in the truth that you are already enough. Performance is a trap that disguises itself as excellence. It starts subtly. You want to do well, to be admired, to be respected. You want to succeed, and there's nothing wrong with that. Until the desire for success starts costing you your sanity. Until the fear of disappointing others begins to control you. Until every step you take, every word you speak, and every move you make is filtered through the question, will they approve of this? That's when performance becomes bondage. And that's when peace starts to feel like a distant dream. When you're caught in the cycle of performance, you're constantly on edge. Your value is tied to your productivity. Your sense of worth is linked to how much you can produce, how many people like you, how perfect your image appears to be. You overcommit because you're afraid to say no. You overcompensate because you don't believe you're enough as you are. You overextend yourself in relationships, in ministry, in work, constantly pouring from a cup that hasn't been refilled in months. And even when the applause comes, it doesn't satisfy. Because no matter how loud the approval, it can't silence the emptiness within when peace is absent. But choosing peace over performance is a radical act of spiritual defiance. It's when you look at the expectations of others and say, I no longer live for your approval. It's when you stop molding yourself to fit someone else's version of who you should be. It's when you realize that true success is not found in how much you can produce, but in how deeply you can rest in who you are. Peace is not laziness. Peace is alignment. It is the confidence to know that you are doing what God called you to do, and that is enough. It is the refusal to measure your worth by worldly standards, and instead anchor yourself in divine identity. Peace teaches you to say no without guilt, to rest without shame, to walk away from expectations that were never yours to carry. When you choose peace, you begin to live differently. You start creating rhythms in your life that prioritize rest, reflection, and restoration. You stop living in survival mode. You start breathing again, thinking clearly, moving from intention rather than impulse. Your calendar becomes less about people-pleasing and more about God-pleasing. Your days are no longer a blur of busyness, but a reflection of balance. Peace doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means you are no longer allowing chaos to control you. This journey requires unlearning. You have to unlearn the belief that being busy equals being valuable. You have to unlearn the lie that says, if you're not constantly producing, you're falling behind. You have to unlearn the toxic message that says your worth is determined by your output. And in place of those lies, you must embrace a deeper truth that you are loved, chosen, and enough, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You are a child of God, not an employee in His kingdom. He's not impressed by your performance. He's after your heart. He's not looking for perfection. He's looking for surrender. And surrender leads to peace. You also begin to discern the difference between divine calling and unhealthy striving. Some of what we call purpose is just our attempt to avoid stillness. Some of what we call drive is just our fear of being forgotten. But when you choose peace, you learn to trust that what is for you will not miss you. You stop running ahead of God. You stop trying to force doors open. You stop burning yourself out, trying to prove something to people who were never called to affirm you. And instead, you settle into the quiet confidence that God is leading you, sustaining you, and working even when you rest. This choice also impacts your relationships. When you are no longer performing, you show up authentically. You stop pretending. You stop shrinking. You stop wearing masks to keep the peace. Instead, you become peace. You carry peace into the spaces you occupy because you've cultivated it within. People feel safer around you because you're not trying to impress them. You're simply being yourself. And that authenticity creates deeper connections, stronger bonds, and more meaningful interactions. You attract people who value presence over performance, substance over image, depth over noise. There's freedom in knowing you don't have to prove your worth. There's rest in knowing you don't have to earn love. There's joy in realizing that you can be successful and peaceful, that the two are not mutually exclusive. When you stop performing, you start living. You start loving your life again. You start dreaming from a healed place. You stop comparing your journey to others because you're no longer racing, you're walking in rhythm. And that rhythm is holy, it is sustainable, it is divine. Choosing peace over performance is not a one-time decision. It is a daily commitment. Every morning you wake up and remind yourself that your worth is secure. Every night you rest knowing that you are held by a God who never needed your performance to begin with. He just wanted your heart. And now that He has it, you can finally lay down the weight of trying to be everything for everyone and simply be who you were created to be. That is peace. That is freedom. That is the life God always had in mind for you.